In lecture 2, we're going to discuss specifically what's included in GDP by breaking GDP down into our different categories and talking about what's included in which category and what's not. And so again, we're going to come up with some shortcomings of GDP, some things that should be there or that would add to the information GDP gives us, but aren't included in GDP for a few reasons. All right, so first, when we're thinking about GDP, we're going to focus in not on the total income, but the total spending part of GDP. So we're going to look at total spending as it relates to GDP, and we're going to break it down into 4 different pieces. First, personal consumer expenditures, or the C of GDP. And often this is called consumption. And so we're looking at consumption by our households. And that is going to be our first component. Our second component is investment. If you recall from our first lecture, we're not talking about investment in the stock market. We're not talking about stock and bond purchases. What we're actually going to be talking about is more on, and most specifically, investment is going to include investment by businesses. So businesses are going to purchase pieces of equipment, factories that are going to allow them to produce more goods and services in the future. So they're investing in their business using raw, hard materials. And that's what we talk about in terms of investment. And then we have government purchases. So at the federal, state, and local level, when the government purchases items, it falls under our government category. And then finally, net exports. And this is going to be the one that we're probably going to spend the most time on in terms of discussion. All right. So once we add all of those different pieces up, our C plus our I plus our G plus our XN, we get GDP. GDP is going to be the sum of all of these components. All right, so first, personal consumer expenditures. Total spending by households on all, remember, those tangible goods and intangible services. So anything that you purchase throughout the day. So whenever you go to the grocery store, or when you get your hair cut, or when you fill your tank with gas, all included in GDP. There is a special note on housing. For renters, consumption includes our rent payment. So very straightforward. When we purchase or when we're renting our apartment, that rent check that we put out each month, that's included in GDP. However, for homeowners, so homeowners consume their house, but we don't just consume our house on the day we purchase our house, right? We consume our house a little bit each month. And so there is an implicit measure cost that we calculate to include in GDP. So it's like the opportunity cost of renting out their home. So if instead you didn't live in your house that you owned, you instead rented that out to somebody else, what would it cost? Or what would they pay in rent? And that's what's included in GDP. So we don't include the whole house's value each month. What we do include is this implicit rent of owning our home. Okay, so on to investments. Investments is total spending on goods that will be used to produce more goods and services in the future, along with a few other caveats. So what we're going to include are different pieces of capital and equipment. So let's say a restaurant purchases a stove. That stove is going to be used to produce many meals, and so that's going to be included in the investments category of GDP. Okay, the same when a construction worker purchases a saw or a hammer. They're going to use that saw and hammer to produce many houses in the future, and so that's going to fall under GDP. New construction in terms of factories, office buildings, and houses. These must be new, okay? Remember, no secondhand sales included in GDP, and that is the same for construction. So if we purchase a factory that's been sitting there vacant for years, that's not included in GDP because nobody has been productive. It's only when we have new construction that we're going to be including in GDP. And the same with houses. This is where we're going to include homes, not just the implicit rental, but we can think about how productive society was in terms of their house, building that house, this year, and that's included in GDP under investments. Probably the only time you're really going to see a household under investments. Okay, and this is where we're not quite produce more goods and services, but inventories. So remember, we want to see how productive we were this year. And so goods that we produced this year, but we haven't sold yet, are going to fall under investment. So that car that we produced this year, but it's not going to be sold until next year, we want to count it in GDP this year, because next year when somebody buys it, it's not, the society wasn't productive. We were productive in this year when we produced the car. And so inventories also included in GDP. So again, new construction included in GDP, pieces of tool, equipment, machinery that are going to allow us to produce more goods and services in the future, and inventories, goods that are produced this year but not yet sold. What's not included in GDP, stocks and bonds are not included in GDP. Remember, those are financial transactions. I'm going to purchase ownership of a company, and that company is then going to use those funds to purchase more goods and services or more pieces of equipment, and so not included in GDP until that business purchases a piece of equipment or whatever they do with those funds. Okay, and again, investment does not include financial assets like stocks and bonds. Okay, government purchases, all spending on goods and services purchased by the government at the federal, state, and local level. So it's going to exclude transfer payments, but anytime we build a new school, or if we repair a highway, or if we build a new park, any of these different items are going to be included in GDP, not when we get our Social Security payments, or we provide welfare, or if we if we give a small business a grant, not included in GDP because there was no productivity happening. So no transfer payments, but anytime we invest in infrastructure, anytime we actually are producing or a new good or service for the economy, that's going to be included in GDP. All right, so net exports. Net exports mean we're subtracting out exports, and remember, exports are going to be goods that are produced in the United States. Sorry, I'm not sure if I said that we're subtracting out. We're adding in exports. So we're taking our GDP and we're adding in exports. Exports are goods that are produced within the borders of the United States, but then consumed abroad. So, well, let's wait. And then imports, let's go through our definitions first. Imports are goods that were produced abroad and then brought to the United States and consumed here. So exports represent that foreign spending on the goods that our economy has produced. Exports are counted in other portions of GDP. So let's go through an example. So let's say that there are some workers in Canada producing goods, and there's some workers in the United States producing goods. So if we export, so our workers in the United States producing all of those goods, and then we ship those goods off to Canada and they're consumed in Canada. The US was so productive there. They were very, very productive. But it's not included in any other part of GDP. It's not being consumed by a US household. It's not being consumed or used by a US business. It's not being consumed by the US government. And so even though the United States was being very productive, it's not included in our other three components. So we have to include exports here in net exports. So we add in exports. What about imports? So imports, those Canadian workers were producing goods and then they shipped them off. So Canada was being very productive, and then those imports came into the United States. They were consumed in the United States. So let's say that it was some lumber to build a house. So the Canadians they chopped down the lumber, they prepared it for the house, and then they shipped it into the United States. And then it's used to build a house. Well, the United States wasn't productive in producing that lumber. They weren't productive in producing that lumber. but it was included under investments for the United States. So even though the United States was not being productive, it was still included in GDP. And so we want to make sure that we don't count this in GDP. So it was already included in GDP, so we have to subtract it out of net exports. So GDP, when we're looking at our imports, they're counted in other pieces, other parts of GDP, and we have to subtract them out because it wasn't the United States that was productive, it was another country. So when we're producing exports, exports are those goods that we're producing them within the United States and we're shipping them out. We are productive and we do want to include those in GDP. However, when we're thinking about imports, goods that were produced abroad, consumed here at home, the United States was not productive. And so we want to subtract out any imports that are included. All right, so GDP, when we're thinking about GDP, we're adding consumption, investment, government spending, and exports, finally subtracting out imports, and that is our measure of GDP. That's what we're going to use as our measure of GDP. So let's go through an example of a few different items of GDP and talk about which components they're going to fall into. So I'm going to let you work on these and then we'll talk about them together. So pause, worked on these 4, and then we'll start up. So hopefully you've taken some time to think about these 4 items. First, Debbie spends $200 to buy her husband dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston. This is included in GDP and it's included under consumption, those personal consumer expenditures. Debbie is a household and she's using that $200 to buy goods and services that were produced within the borders of the United States. Sarah spends $1,800 on a new laptop used in her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. This is going to be an import. So what we see is when Sarah spends $1,800 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business, that falls under investment, and it made investment go up $1,800. But the United States was not productive. They were not productive in producing this laptop, and so we have to subtract that $1,800 out of imports so that the net effect is 0. So there ends up being no effect on GDP because investment went up by $1,800, imports went down, those two cancel each other out, and then there is no effect on GDP. Jane spends $1,200 on a computer to use in her editing business. She got last year's model on sale for a great price. This is not included in GDP. It was actually included in GDP last year. Last year, that computer sat in inventory, and so it was included in the investment portion. Since it was not produced this year, it was not included in GDP. General Motors builds $500 million worth of cars, but consumers purchase only $470 million. That inventory is just sneaking up on us again. Here, we see that consumers purchase $470 million worth of cars. That $470 million is going to be included in GDP under the consumption. But General Motors was $500 million productive. So where does that other $30 million worth of cars go? It sits in inventories. It's going to sit in inventories through this year so that we can show how productive our society was. So hopefully you've gotten a good firm grip on those different components of GDP. If you need extra practice on those, make sure you see the worksheet. So what about GDP problems? There are problems and criticisms of GDP, and there's 4 specific problems with GDP that are probably the most popular. First, remember, goods that don't have a market value are not included in GDP. This is most important as we see different families decide things like stay-at-home parents. Stay-at-home parents add a lot of value, and there are estimates that having a stay-at-home parent, the value that they contribute to the household can be $100,000 or plus. They're very productive for society, however, it's not included in GDP. Anytime anyone does any yard work or housework themselves, it's not included in GDP. And so one of the shortcomings of GDP is this inability to measure items that don't have a market value. Our next shortcoming of GDP is that the underground economy is not included in GDP. So illegal activities such as drugs, prostitution, gambling, not included in GDP. So there are very productive people in society. They're not doing legal activities, but they are being productive. But it's not included in GDP. So again, shortcoming, it's underestimating the actual level of productivity for our economy. Next, leisure is not included in GDP. So it might sound great to have a really high level of GDP. Everybody in our economy is so productive. But if everybody's so productive that they don't have any time to take a vacation, does that mean people are happy? So we do see in one of the extra videos that you can watch is that there are other indicators out there that measure a similar item but also take into account things like happiness. So happiness is also very important and we want to consider that, but it's not included in GDP. And then also another common complaint on GDP is that it doesn't take into account the air quality or the pollution that's created from the productive activities that are going on. So GDP doesn't measure those social costs to society of things like pollution. All right, so for the big complaints with GDP, keep these in mind when you hear reports on the level of GDP, if it's rising or whatever. Make sure you take into account all of these different pieces and recognize that GDP isn't a perfect measure. There may be other indicators that we also want to look at.